Good morning. I would ask that everyone please take your seats so that we can get started. It is such a pleasure to be in a room about higher education policy that is rowdy and requires us to take a moment to quiet down before we get started. So, thank you all for being here today. My name is Beth Akers, and I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. I am so pleased to welcome you here to what I think is going to be a really exciting and fascinating conversation. We have some presentation of some new research as well as some really critical conversation about where policy has come, where we are headed, and some of the methodological challenges and data challenges that exist along that road. Before we move into the panel portion of our event today, I want to take a few minutes to set the stage. So, as I said, I think this is really an exciting moment for higher education, an exciting moment for this movement towards value-based accountability in higher education. If you read the headlines about higher education in the popular press right now, as I know all of you do, you're probably very familiar with some of the negative sentiments that seem to be populating those pages right now. Institutions are closing, they're struggling with declining enrollments and the impending demographic cliff that will cause them to struggle to fill their seats, to pay their faculty, and to remain in business as they have been for generations. We've also know that Americans are feeling more pessimistic about education, higher education in particular, than they have in generations. Tremendously concerning trends. At the same time, I have tremendous optimism about the moment that we are in today, and in large part because of a landmark legislative reform that came last summer in the form of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The last comprehensive reauthorization of the Higher Education Act came in 2008. Since then, we've had piecemeal reforms, many of which were to the detriment of the functioning of our higher education federal financial aid systems. The changes that we saw in terms of accountability and holding institutions to account for the outcomes that their students experience, particularly in the labor market, are really a massive reorientation of what Americans expect from higher education. And I'm hugely optimistic about how that will cause a reinvention of this sector that is struggling in the ways that I just mentioned. While the new do no economic harm standard does represent a relatively low bar, it also represents a tremendously massive shift, both in the way that we think about what is expected of institutions and also in the terms of the infrastructure for federal policy and the way that we give aid to institutions and the very concrete incentives that they face as a result of those policies. This change comes after decades of well meaning, but I would say incomplete themes that captured the sentiment of the policy reform of those eras. We first talked about access really intensely, this idea that we just need to get everybody into college. We all know that was well meaning and good intentioned, and yet that fell short of what the nation needed, of what individual students needed. We shifted to talking extensively about affordability, the idea that people need to be able to make ends meet and make this investment in themselves. Again, well-meaning, but fell short. We realized that people were not completing those degrees, and in some instances were being left worse off than when they started, perhaps as a result of both the affordability and the access eras of thought leadership. So we shifted to the ideas of completion, but again, an incomplete notion of what it is that we should be asking of higher education. But historically, the ideas of value-based accountability that we're talking about today and that I'm celebrating in my work currently, they weren't an option. When many of us went to college, we were not shopping based on the data that were available in the college scorecard. We flipped through the US News and World Report booklet in the back of Barnes and Nobles if we were too cheap to buy it to bring it home. And we were not making informed decisions that are possible today because of the tremendous innovation that was made during the Obama administration, which is the advent of the college scorecard, which both made this data logistically available, but I also think transformed the way that the public, lawmakers, and thought leaders just thought about the idea, again, of what it is that higher education needs to deliver to the American people. So this shift enabled value-based thinking. And I'm so thrilled to say that today I believe that we are no longer in the access, affordability, completion eras of policymaking, of thought leadership, but rather we're in a value-based era of thinking about what it is that higher education needs to deliver. Given that, we are still to a degree hamstrung by the availability of data. Accountability, value-based accountability requires that we know what's happening to students after they finish their degree. Unfortunately, that requires data that we don't have completely today. But that offers a perfect segue to the conversation that we're going to have in our first panel today. So we have the privilege of hearing the presentation of brand new, remarkably innovative research put together by the Post-Secondary Commission in concert with Mathematica, using new data from Texas and rigorous methods to generate some of the most precise estimates of the value created by higher educational institutions and programs that we have seen today. Following that study, we will move on to a panel that will be moderated by my esteemed colleague, Preston Cooper. They will discuss the study as well as general methodological challenges of measuring value as we shift towards a value-based policymaking infrastructure. We'll then take a break. You can grab a coffee. Following that, I will moderate a panel that I'm tremendously excited about with two very good friends of mine who also happen to be among the most influential individuals in higher education policymaking from both the current and the previous administrations, and that's Nicholas Kent and James Cavall. During both of these panels, you, the audience, will have an opportunity to ask questions. Those of you in the room will wait for our prompting, and then we will come with a microphone for you to ask those questions. And those of you who are watching us online can send your questions to Richard Keck, my colleague here at AEI. His email is available on the event website. So without further ado, I will introduce Stieg Leschly, who is the president and founder of the Post-Secondary Commission, which is an aspiring accreditor of outcomes-focused and innovative colleges, and also the board chair and co-founder and former CEO of both Fish Tank Learning and Duet. He previously was CEO of Match Education, as well as the founder and managing partner at Newark Charter School Fund. He will be joined by Whitney Kozakowski. Whitney is a senior researcher at Mathematica, where she has worked since completing her PhD at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So I will turn it over to them now.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you to all of you for being here this morning. My name is Stieg Leschly. As Beth mentioned, I'm the president of the Post-Secondary Commission. I would like to start with a thank you and a nod to the people who lead higher education policy in Texas for doing the hard work over many years of assembling an exemplary state-level student longitudinal data system, and for allowing us and many other researchers access to that system. Two of those leaders are here in the room today, and they have my gratitude: Commissioner Wynn Rosser and Deputy Commissioner David Troutman, both from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Thank you. The Post-Secondary Commission, as some of you know, and as Beth mentioned, is an emerging accreditor. We specialize in working with institutions that produce the very thing we'll talk about today: strong and measurable economic outcomes for students. And in that regard, we're a user of our own research. But our motivation in doing the study we'll discuss today is not only to enable our own work as an outcomes-focused accreditor. It is also, and importantly, to produce research for the public good. It is to generate findings and to reveal a methodology that can be useful in Texas and in the country. In designing our study, we challenged ourselves to devise a methodology that measures the right thing, that rivals the rigor and accuracy of academic studies, and that can be implemented at scale. My hope is that the methodology that we'll reveal today can serve as a useful prompt to policymakers, especially in data-rich states like Texas, who are interested in cutting-edge approaches to assessing students' economic outcomes accurately and at scale, and in setting policy accordingly. Our methodology aside, I also hope that our findings will be useful to decision makers of all kinds in the sector, including in particular leaders of institutions who need new and good information on the outcomes of their students. With those quick thoughts, I'll make way for Whitney Kozakowski to talk you through the study, which you can read about in full on the website that we published this morning and to which you've been given the URL. Whitney, as Beth mentioned, is a senior researcher at Mathematica, and she's part of the extraordinary team at Mathematica who helped us implement this study over the last few years. Whitney.
Thank you so much, Stieg. Good morning, everyone. As Stieg mentioned, I'm going to share a bit today about our work building an approach to estimate the returns to post-secondary education at scale using data from Texas. So as many in this room know, there's a broad landscape of approaches to measuring the economic returns to post-secondary institutions and programs. First, there's an academic literature that's traditionally used student-level data and rigorous causal methods to estimate the returns to post-secondary institutions. However, these designs are they're difficult to implement at scale. So many institutions just do not have the necessary features that are needed to use these more rigorous designs. And many of the designs only provide estimates for a narrow portion of the student body, rather than, say, the average student, which is important for policymaking. There's also a series of measures that are often using publicly available data to measure the returns to the economic returns to post-secondary institutions. And these measures have traditionally compared the earnings of a program's graduates to those who only have a high school degree, often located in a similar geographic location, typically a state, sometimes a metro area. So our approach we really see as sitting in between these two. We use rich student-level administrative data from states rather than public data. And we're using an approach that can be more easily scaled across institutions and programs than most academic studies are using. So specifically in this work, we use individual-level data from Texas to estimate the impact of enrolling in an institution or program on students' cumulative earnings during a given period of time. And that period of time for certificate seekers is 5 years, for associate seekers is 10 years, and for bachelor's degree seekers is 15. We chose these different follow-up periods to accommodate differences in program length and cost, with shorter credentials having a shorter follow-up period. And so our approach is going to be comparing the cumulative earnings of students who enroll in an institution or a program within an institution to their specific matched comparison group, which consists of similar individuals who did not enroll in further post-secondary education during the follow-up period. So we refer to this difference as cumulative value-added earnings. You'll hear me refer to cumulative VAE as a shorthand for this. And it's an estimate essentially of how much a student's cumulative earnings change as a result of enrolling in an institution or a program. Importantly in this approach, we adjust for a range of student characteristics through a matching process. So we match students to individuals in the comparison group using a large number of characteristics, such as prior earnings, standardized test scores from high school, age at entry, household income in high school, the county of the high school that a student attended, and a range of other demographic and academic characteristics built from this rich K-12 data. So after calculating gains in cumulative earnings over the follow-up period, we then subtract students' total net costs of enrolling in an institution to calculate cumulative net VAE, and that's the measure we'll be talking about a lot today. So we calculate net cost as the direct cost of enrollment, and that includes cost of tuition, fees, and supplies, minus financial aid that students receive in the form of tuition waivers, grants, and scholarships. And so overall, we see this approach as having several key strengths. So first, it adjusts for differences in the types of students that are entering different institutions and programs. And that's important because we know that students who enroll in college, particularly at more selective colleges, might have done better in the labor market regardless of any input from that post-secondary institution. So in order to isolate what an institution is actually adding to help a student be more successful in the labor market, we need to think about adjusting for students' characteristics at entry. Second, our approach focuses on all students who enroll, not just graduates. That's important because, as Beth noted, we know that 40% of students nationally who start at 2- and 4-year colleges do not actually complete a degree within 6 years, but they do bear the costs of that enrollment. I will also note here that we're not limited to focusing on students that receive federal financial aid as well. So third, another strength of our approach is that we can follow students over a long and continuous period of time to capture cumulative gains. And also foregone earnings that a student incurs while they're enrolled in college. So those are the lost earnings that a student incurs while they're pursuing college as opposed to working full-time in the workforce. And we find that those costs are actually quite large, so we think it's important that we're able to capture those in addition to the direct costs of enrollment. And lastly, compared to academic studies, our approach is more scalable across institutions. So we can actually implement this for all 2- and 4-year institutions in Texas. And we've built an algorithm that will allow us to produce estimates for institutions, programs, and demographic groups efficiently. So for the work in Texas, I'll talk a little bit about the sample of individuals that we use. So we use individuals who graduated from a Texas high school from 2007-8 through 2017-18 to estimate cumulative net VAE. So these high school data are nice because they provide a common source of data for both the cohorts of students entering post-secondary institutions and for the comparison group. We generate estimates for 86 public institutions in the state, covering over 900,000 students that have entered post-secondary education between 2008-9 and 2018-19, depending on the degree type. We look at 29 institutions for bachelor's degree seekers and 57 institutions for associate or certificate degree seekers. And we also break these institution cohorts out further at the program level within institutions and by student demographic groups within these institutions. So specifically, the groups we'll be looking at include age at entry, high school math achievement, and family income. Okay, so now for the fun part. So now we're going to transition to looking through some of the findings from this study. So as Stieg noted, we have a full report. It's over 100 pages and a website. So there's a lot of findings that we could be sharing. So please think of this as just a highlight reel of some interesting things, but we very much encourage you to go to the report and the website to see more. So here in this figure on the vertical axis, you can see cumulative net VAE, and on the horizontal axis, years from entry into college. So on average, we see that bachelor's degree seeking students, as represented by this blue line here, received cumulative net VAE of $87,000 after 15 years. Associate's degree seekers, represented by the red line, received cumulative net VAE of over $25,000 after 10 years. And certificate students received cumulative net VAE of around $44,000 after 5 years. We also examine at what point students break even in their investment. And so here in this figure, we can see this is when those lines cross zero. That's when students are breaking even. And we can see for bachelor's degree students, that's happening right around just after year 9. For associate's degree seeking students, that's happening around year 7. And for certificate students, that's happening around year 4. So on average, we see that these investments are paying off. But now we'll look at how cumulative net VAE varies across institutions. And so what we see here is that for nearly all institutions for bachelor's and associate degree seekers, nearly all of them are offering positive cumulative net VAE through the end of the follow-up period, with the exception of 2 institutions for bachelor's degree seekers and about 1 institution for associate degree seekers. But we can also see that there's a lot of variation across institutions. So for bachelor's degree seekers, an institution at the 90th percentile of this distribution would have cumulative net VAE of about $116,000, compared to closer to $28,000 for an institution at the 10th percentile. So that's a pretty wide difference in outcomes. Similarly, for associate degree seekers, we see that cumulative net VAE at the 90th percentile was about $52,000 compared to $4,000 at the 10th percentile. So again, it's a pretty wide distribution. For certificate seekers, we see that about 3/4 of institutions offered positive cumulative net VAE at the end of 5 years, while 1/4 did not. And we see that cumulative net VAE, again, ranged a lot. So from negative $7,000 at the 10th percentile to about $16,000 at the 90th. And I will note for the certificate seekers, this is at the end of a 5-year period, and something we plan to explore in further work is how much these estimates might change with a longer follow-up period for the certificate seekers. Okay, so now we'll switch to looking at the results by students' programs. So here you can see the results for bachelor's degree seekers. And we see that cumulative net VAE after 15 years was positive on average across program types, but that there's a lot of variation by field. So here in this figure, bubble size indicates the number of students in the sample that are enrolled in different types of programs. And so focusing on the bigger bubbles, we see that engineering and architecture, which includes things like mechanical engineering, computer engineering, had large positive cumulative net VAE of around $200,000. Business and economics was also high at around $180,000, and biology and health was around $100,000. We also saw that liberal arts, social sciences, and communications had lower than average cumulative net VAE after 15 years. So on average, students enrolled in STEM programs we see, so that can include things like agricultural and natural resources, biology and health, engineering and architecture, physical sciences and math, technical trades, information technology. On average, that these programs tend to have higher returns than non-STEM programs. So now we'll switch to the results for associate degree seekers. So here you can see cumulative net VAE after 10 years was generally positive for program types, but not for all program types. And again, there was wide variation across program types. So again, focusing on the bigger bubbles here, we see some of the patterns are similar to what we saw with the bachelor's degree seekers. So business and economics and biology and health tended to have above average cumulative net VAE of around $40,000, while liberal arts programs have cumulative net VAE of around $17,000. But there are also some other interesting patterns in these associate results. So first, construction trades and technical trades, which train students to be technicians in fields like automotive, engineering, and manufacturing technology, has the highest cumulative net VAE, while logistics, which is training students to work in things like transportation and materials moving, and personal and culinary services, which is training people to work in the restaurant industry, has negative cumulative net VAE on average. So due to time constraints, we're not going to look at the results for certificates, but I certainly encourage you to do that within the report. So next, we're going to look at how cumulative net VAE varied for different groups of students. So here you can see the results for bachelor's degree seeking students. And looking at the right of this figure, we can see that cumulative net VAE is strongly related to a student's high school math achievement. Notably, we see a similar pattern for associate's degree seekers, but the pattern is more muted for certificate seekers. Second, on the left, we also examine how cumulative net VAE varied based on family income in high school. And we see that for bachelor's degree seekers, cumulative net VAE is actually quite similar for students from low-income families compared to other students. For other degree types, the patterns varied a bit more by family income. So for associate's degree students, we saw cumulative net VAE was slightly higher for higher income students. And for certificates, we saw the opposite, that it was slightly higher for low income students. In the report and on the website, we can also see how cumulative net VAE varied by age. And one interesting finding from that I'll share is that for both associates and certificate seekers, we found that older students tended to have higher cumulative net VAE. So to conclude here, the approach that we have been using is using rich student longitudinal data that links K-12 records to post-secondary and workforce data to really provide a more complete picture of post-secondary value. So there are a few key features of the work. So we're able to include all students who enter, not just graduates. We're able to look at opportunity costs of enrollment, so foregone earnings, in addition to the direct net costs. We're also able to cover a longer time horizon to capture returns over a longer period of time, which is important if we think labor market returns might change over time or grow over time for different degree types. And then lastly, we're able to adjust for student characteristics at entry. And we do find that this last piece matters a lot. So for bachelor's degrees, we find that without adjusting for student characteristics, cumulative net VA would have been inflated by about 30% for bachelor's degrees. So that has important implications for thinking about approaches that are not able to adjust for student characteristics. There are also some important challenges or limitations that I'll note to have in mind with these measures. So first, this approach really does require rich longitudinal data systems, as I noted before, that have linked K-12 to post-secondary and the workforce, ideally going back a long period of time. Not all states have developed these systems, and the linkage is not currently possible at the federal level. So second, also the approach works best in states with low out-of-state migration. That's because we only observe employment for those who reside in state. So this is gonna work best in states, for example, that don't have large metros straddling state borders. And then third, the approach likely cannot adjust for all the differences between students who choose to enroll in post-secondary education and those who do not during the follow-up period. And that's gonna be particularly true at the most selective institutions. So with that, I will pass this back over to Stig.
Thank you, Whitney. Just another thought before Preston comes up. The study we're publishing today and that Whitney just described to you is a beginning for us. It is version 1 of a study that we will repeat and improve on in the years ahead in Texas and in other states. In doing successive versions of this study, our twin goal will remain to surface useful findings for the field and to pioneer a methodology that measures accurately at scale. In future versions of this work, we will study in detail how the economic outcomes of non-completers of various kinds differ from those of completers, a crucial and poorly understood question in our sector. We will examine students' outcomes for longer follow-up periods than the ones we chose in this version of the study, as Whitney mentions. We will study when the early results of a cohort, especially a bachelor's degree cohort, can be used to predict reliably their long-term and terminal outcomes. We will do more analysis of the precision and the accuracy of our institution-specific estimates, including analysis of their stability over time and analysis of the sample sizes that we will require when evaluating individual institutions, and so on. We look forward to doing this work with feedback and in partnership with all of you. And as I said at the beginning, we're all grateful to the leadership in Texas for letting us get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stig and Whitney. I'm so impressed by this research. I mean, this is, as Stig said at the beginning, I mean, this is monumental. I just want to take a moment to appreciate that we have done a super rigorous, causal analysis of what the value of college actually is, and you guys have done it at scale, which is just, I just want to impress that is something that has not really been done before. And so, just very impressed with this. I'm so glad that I've been able to be a part of this event. So I'm going to invite the rest of our first panel up to the stage. So if you're on that first panel, please come up right now, and I'll introduce everybody one by one. Here we go. So you already know Stig and Whitney. Beth introduced them at the beginning. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Preston Cooper. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. And then all the way over on the my right, your left, we have Zach Bleemer, who is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton University. Jason Delisle, who is the chief economist in the office of the undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education, and also my former boss and a former AEI scholar. And we have David Troutman, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Academic and Workforce Initiatives at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. So I will take my seat here. So Zach, I want to start with you for this first panel. So the research that we just saw here up on screen is trying to answer what I think is actually a very deceptively simple question, which is, are you going to be better off financially if you go to college? Can you share a little bit about why that question is actually kind of tricky to answer and what the research currently tells us about the answer to that question?
Absolutely. Thanks, Preston. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning. So what I want to do is sort of take a step back and think about what academics have learned about the relative value of college going in America over the last 30 or 40 years, and then how this report, I think, really pushes forward and meaningfully contributes to how academics have understood American higher education. So economists in the US basically spent the 1990s with regard to education trying to understand whether college was a good idea at all. We know that people who go to college earn about 80% more than people who don't go to college. Is that because college is offering kids something of value, or is it because smart kids go to college, dumb kids don't go to college, and the smart kids would have done well whether or not they had attended school? We did a lot of research in the 1990s trying to understand this question. I think we answered the question. The answer to the question is that college provides tremendous value to students, on the order of 10 to 15% of wages per year enrolled in college. And nearly all of the observational differences in wages between college goers and non-college goers is causal. It's because the kids went to college. So that then leads to a whole series of new questions. If college is valuable to students, for whom is it valuable, and which college is valuable to students? Economists spent a lot of the 2000s trying to answer the first of those questions, not which college is valuable, but who should go to college. And I think there was a lot of interest first in are there a bunch of dumb kids who would be better off not enrolling in higher education? And second, there are good colleges and bad colleges. Should the smart kids go to the good colleges and the dumb kids go to the bad colleges? Are we making a mistake in how we're allocating which students go to which schools and which students earn which majors? It turns out, I think, that that line of research was pretty misdirected. It turns out that almost all students benefit tremendously from almost all colleges and programs. And so we learned a lot about, for example, relatively low testing and low GPA students who could barely access the lowest tier of American higher education, either going to community college or going to low-tier regional public universities. And you might think those kids might have been better off not going to college at all, and that's wrong. We now have great evidence from Massachusetts, from Georgia, from Texas, that even kids right on the margin of college going benefit tremendously from going to college, that kids who are on the margin of going to community college benefit substantially from going to community college. There was a lot of interest in the 2000s and early 2010s in whether programs like race-based affirmative action and other programs that pulled lower testing students into highly selective universities might be doing those students a disservice by pulling them into schools that they couldn't handle, that they would be mismatched in. And it turns out that's not the case. In fact, if anything, these students derive above average value from going to more selective universities. The question isn't who should go to college. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot for the last couple of years. Instead, the question is which college should they go to and what kind of things should they study in college? And that's where this report comes in. And I think it's been a really central focus of academic research over the last 10 years, because it turns out that while there isn't that much variation between students in who gets value from college, there is tremendous variation in the value that different colleges and programs provide to students. So, okay, so how do we know, or what does that variation look like? If, for example, you compare the average wages of computer science graduates and humanities graduates in the US, you get gaps that are much larger even than the gap between college goers and non-college goers. Since the 1960s, people with computer science degrees earn something like 150% more than people with humanities college degrees, all conditional on earning a college degree. That has not changed in recent years, despite recent news reports to the contrary. Computer science remains by far the highest paying major in the US. And so, okay, now we have this new question. Do computer science majors earn a lot of money because computer science degrees are super valuable, or because super bright people are able to get into and achieve and succeed in computer science programs? So that's this new key question. Is all of this variation across colleges and programs causal, or just the result of which students earn which degrees? This has, I think, become particularly politically pressing in recent years because there are many degrees where the average graduate earns less money than the average high school graduate. You might think that that's because these programs have negative value, but it might instead be something different. It might be that there's a lot of very low testing students who attend programs that are accessible to them, which are relatively low value programs, but still might lead people to be better off than that same student would have been if they hadn't gone to that program. In other words, they aren't the average high school graduate. They were never going to earn as much money even as the average person who doesn't go to college. So for that kid, for the kid who's no matter what going to be quite low earning in society, is it nevertheless the case that they should go to a certificate program, something that's easily accessible, that could raise their wage a little bit, even if it leaves them below the average high school graduate? So how have economists approached this problem? Something that Whitney mentioned in her presentation is we spend a lot of time thinking about natural experiments, crazy settings that randomly moved some students from one program to another or one school to another, that allowed us in these really unique settings to really conclusively say, okay, this is the value of going to one or another college program. So to give you one example of this, during the financial crisis, many colleges and universities in the US just saw this influx of students where everyone wanted to study economics. And their faculties couldn't handle all the students who wanted to study economics. And universities imposed GPA-based restrictions. If you come in, you take your first 2 economics courses, you get a B- average, that's not good enough. You can't cut it. You're going to have to go study something else. And so those students had to go study, God forbid, sociology, anthropology, political science, much lower earning degrees than things like economics and business. So what economists could do, and this is something I've done in my prior work, is you compare kids right on the margin. They almost got a B+, but instead they got a B. And because they got a B, they had to go study sociology instead. And you compare these kids who are otherwise really similar to each other, but one was allowed to study economics, the other was forced to study sociology. You follow these kids forward for 10 years, and you see not only do the kids who are allowed to study economics make a lot more money than the kids who are forced to study sociology, but here's this remarkable fact that now really connects back to the research we're thinking about today. If you had guessed, okay, this kid studies economics, this kid studies sociology, let's just look at the average wages of people who study economics at this university and people who study sociology at this university, and guess the effect on this student by the average difference in wages between these students. Could you have guessed correctly the actual causal value of studying economics for the student? And the answer, it turns out, was yes. That if you did the kind of careful work that was presented by the Post-Secondary Commission this morning, if you found matched controls for each of these students and followed these kids forward 10 years and tried to guess using the best available observational methodology, what is the actual causal effect of being allowed to study economics? It turns out your guess would have done a really good job. So that's, I think, where this study comes in. Academia, for the last 10 years, has been focused on finding these really kind of quirky natural experiments that quasi-randomly shock people into more valuable college degrees. And what we've been doing is we've been constructing what we call forecast coefficients. So a forecast coefficient is just a number that says, okay, you're the Post-Secondary Commission, and you have all of these numbers for this is the value of this program, this is the value of that program. What we want to know is, for a kid who actually switches from one program to another, do they actually make as much more money as you would have expected given the estimates put forward by this matching methodology? And the forecast coefficient says, okay, for every extra $1 that this methodology suggests you're going to earn, how much more money do people actually earn if they actually switch from one program to another? And what economists have learned over the last 10 years is that, for example, if you compare between college majors using the kind of matching technology that is being presented today, what's the forecast coefficient of those estimates? It's roughly 1. That's really good news. What that means is this kind of methodology does a really good job of predicting which programs actually provide value to students. For every dollar that these estimates suggest kids are going to earn by switching into a higher value major, they in fact earn roughly $1 more. For when you're measuring across programs, the forecast coefficient is a little bit lower. We think that it's something like 0.7 or 0.8, but that's still really good. I think we should feel very good about that. We've been able to put forward a matching methodology that is able to comprehensively estimate the relative value of different colleges and programs in the US. And while we haven't been able to do it perfectly, there's clearly measurement error in various places. There are some programs that are actually better than they look in this methodology and others that are actually worse. And over time, as Stieg mentioned, I think this methodology will be improved and the forecast coefficient will slowly start to converge toward 1. Still, we're already at something like a 0.7 and 0.8. And that's, I think, really fantastic. We've learned a lot, and we can now start moving forward, now that we have all of these estimates, moving forward with, okay, now let's use this to try to improve student outcomes and to try to improve the economic outcomes of a state. So let me just conclude with, I think, a couple of places where that you should have in the back of your mind of like, we've learned a lot here. We've been able to make a lot of progress leveraging both insights from academia and now sort of translating those insights into actionable, practicable estimates over every, in this case, college and program in the state of Texas. What else should you have in the back of your mind? So one thing you should keep in mind is that we're thinking about individual wages here, but welfare isn't just individual wages. Welfare comes from household wages. So part of the return to college isn't just how much money you make. It's the match that you make in college. It's the household you end up living in 10 or 15 years later. One thing to think about is we haven't quite captured overall welfare here, but we're just focusing on these individual wages. I think there's a lot of plausible work that could be done to try to understand the value of different programs, not just in terms of what job you get, but who you marry and what household you end up in given what program you attend. And that's a little bit of extra welfare information that isn't captured here. There's other things like that. So for example, we're measuring wages here. We might also care about entrepreneurship and business income, a lot of other economic activity that comes out of college that's a lot more difficult to measure than just looking at individual wage returns. I think it could be really important to think about, okay, which programs don't just lead to individual wage value, but lead to overall economic growth and economic success, which not only includes how much money I make, but how much money I make on behalf of the state or for myself, my community, and the state as a whole.
So
And,
I think I'd
yeah.
like
Oh,
to.
Okay, I'll pass back to you. So in any case, I think this is pretty exciting work that I think moves this academic literature forward. I'm delighted to talk to it.
Thanks very much, Zach. So Stieg, I want to go to you next. So you're an aspiring accreditor.
Yeah.
And commissioning statewide studies of college return on investment is not something that accreditors have historically done. So why did you feel that it was important that the Post-Secondary Commission, commission this study? How does this advance your mission to, start accrediting schools in maybe a little bit of a different way?
Sure. The technology, the method, the thing we're measuring here is at the very core of our work in parallel as an accreditor. We're an emerging one. We're seeking federal recognition to function as an accreditor. And we will set out to measure and observe and accredit based on this very metric. We will struggle in various locations and in various situations to find the data we need, Preston, to evaluate this as institutions. And so our sort of market share, if you will, is constrained by access to data. We went to Texas originally, it seems like everybody in American higher ed heads to Texas, to do our initial accreditation work and were granted access to the data down there as an accreditor. And then the study emerged from there, and we grew into this interest we have now in doing these kinds of studies. So the short answer is, Preston, we need, like all regulators is how I would phrase it, whether a state or a government, we're an atypical regulator, if you will. We need to observe this outcome in institutions. It's very high stake in accreditation. We need to do it with the kind of fidelity that Zach and Whitney are describing. We can't afford to be wrong about this. And so we need data everywhere we can get it. We need these kinds of methods. And so we vacuum up state data and federal data in every single way to enable ourselves to accredit in this way. So now we have just, as it turns out, it's so much fun working with Whitney and the economists of Mathematica, and we think this work is so important separately that we'll do it in parallel and as an own body of work.
Excellent. David, I'd love to bring you in on this question as well. So, I mean, as Stieg mentioned, Texas has the best higher education data anywhere in the country. I don't think anyone would disagree with that here. And, I mean, that made this study possible in a place like Texas that it might not be possible somewhere else. But, if you're giving advice to another state that says, wow, I really love this evaluation, I'd love to do something like this in my own state, what would that other state need to do to make their data more like Texas? And what kind of advantages does having this great data in Texas give you when you're overseeing higher ed in the Great Lone Star State?
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the easy question. That's such an easy question to answer. Oh my gosh. I think first, I want to thank a couple of groups. I think first, Stieg and Mathematica for working with us and really pushing the boundaries on how we can use data. Second, I want to thank the Texas elected politicians that had the vision 25 years ago. This doesn't happen yesterday. It was 25 years ago that they created a data infrastructure. And then third, I want to thank Governor Abbott for creating the Tri-Agency Workforce Initiative. Because when you can collect data, that doesn't mean that you can use the data in an agile way. And so by creating this tri-agency, we've created this strong relationship across multiple agencies for K through 12 post-sec and workforce that is giving us the agility to literally have access to data in a couple of weeks versus several months. So I think thinking through and suggesting to a state, think through how you can create both in contracts and agreements so that you can share data fluidly and easily, and go big or go home. Like let's collect. So in our data system, we collect thousands of data variables, and then my team is in charge of putting those data together longitudinally, storing those both in a server, on virtual, so that we can have researchers access these data to create insight, accountability, other measures that we could use to bring to life. So I would encourage a state to think through who are your stakeholders you're going to be engaging with. The first stakeholder that we focus in on is students and parents of Texans. We've created mytexasfuture.org, where they can easily go and click on a couple of buttons to understand the value add or earnings outcomes associated with a program of study. So I would also encourage a state to think through, how do you get that information out? Just building a website doesn't mean they're going to come to that website. You actually have to create policy that requires 8th graders and counselors and others to log in, create profiles, and actually use these data for the good, so we have informed insight. I would also encourage states to think through policy that leads to improvement and accountability as it relates to the value added assessment. So for example, what this study shows us is that it's not just the institution that you're going to, it's what program of study you're actually graduating from. And so through House Bill 8, that was such a game changer. Now we're actually providing funding for community colleges and not providing funding for community colleges based on the program of study. We've identified the arts as an associate, so we'll think associate's degrees, the arts, psychology, communication. There are 6 categories that we're no longer funding in the state of Texas because it is not adding value. It's not a credential of value, it's actually a credential of harm. And so, you really have to, I would encourage a state to really think through how you can redistribute and adjust and require individual presidents and chancellors to reshape their portfolio of programs that they offer so it's providing value. And then I would encourage that you have to think through, I'm never satisfied, if anybody knows me, I'm never satisfied with my most recent accomplishment. You have to push forward. We're working with the Texas Workforce Commission to enhance UIUA records. So that we'll have, starting in 27, we'll have more enhanced with occupational title, part-time, full-time, where the individual resides in the county. And so that's gonna help us open the door of understanding program to occupation and no longer having these proxies that really tell the story. And then, once again, just keeping pushing where we're working with the 4-year systems to propose a performance-based model for 4 years now. So we're really going to be thinking the value added. And I would encourage a state to make it a part of their DNA. I was speaking to the commissioner, we're thinking through all the things that we've done. So we've created this webpage that gathers all the links that we have out there. And so he said, well, David, this is gonna be easy for you because you talk about it every day. And we do. And so that's when we approach a meeting, we think about how is this going to benefit students economically? And then that leads to further conversations. So I would encourage a state, just be courageous, take a risk, and know that you're doing that for the residents of your state that's going to benefit them in the long term.
One great thing about the Texas data is that you don't just have data on people who touch post-secondary education in some way and then go to the labor force. You also have information about people who graduate high school, then go straight into the labor force, may not touch post-secondary education at all. And this is critical for creating the counterfactual. We don't just need to know, what you earn if you do go to college. We need to benchmark that against something. We need to know what you would have earned if you had not gone to college at all. This is where the data on high school graduates really comes in. Whitney, I'd love to go back to something you said during your presentation, which is that, if you just look at a pure comparison of the people who go to college versus the people with only high school, the gap is here. But if you look at, your adjusted benchmark, right? So, you're accounting for math scores, you're accounting for all this other stuff, there's still a big gap. There's still a big return to college, but that closes by about 30% or so, I think you said. And so could you tell us a little bit more about the process of kind of developing that counterfactual? What is really important for researchers and policymakers to understand about creating that benchmark, and what kind of student characteristics should people be taking into account when they're trying to get a true apples-to-apples comparison for the purposes of measuring college ROI?
That's a great question, Preston. We were lucky in using Texas's data for a lot of reasons. So you mentioned this link between the K-12 data and the post-secondary and the workforce data. And so what that gives us is really rich data from K-12. And so that includes things related to academic achievement. It includes standardized test scores, right? Students have to graduate, they have to take, to graduate, they need to take tests. We get really good data on their standardized test performance. That happens to be very important for this matching process. We can also get data on prior earnings for these students too, and that's particularly important for the older students that are coming in, right? A lot of the students, particularly for the certificates programs or for the associates, they're coming back from the labor force, right? And so having prior earnings to include as part of that match, knowing something about their labor trajectory, were they employed? How much did they earn coming into this? It's really important. So from our perspective, having measures related to academic achievement is particularly important, having measures related to prior earnings. Really, we're looking for things that predict what makes a student likely to go back to college and what is related to their earnings. And so anything, we're data hungry, right? Well, we want anything related to those things. Texas has been pretty generous in providing that. And something I'll also note is that moving forward, something that we want to do is to try to get at which of these variables do you really need in a state in order to execute this approach well. So right now, we use a lot of variables. And something we would like to do moving forward is to figure out, can you cut back? And how much can you cut back? Just because in some states you will need to cut back. So just sort of nailing down, what are the critical ones? We certainly have our hypotheses. I think it's earnings and test scores in particular, but it would be nice to know and sort of nail this down a little bit further. So when we go to other states, we can say, oh, is this going to work well here or not? So that's for the future.
That's great. So, here at the American Enterprise Institute, we're big believers in federalism. We love seeing states lead on data, and we know that, unfortunately, I'm going to pick on Jason, that the federal government is about 20 years behind the state of Texas in terms of the data that the federal government has, which is, I mean, still very impressive. What you have, but but I do want to ask, for looking at this from the federal perspective, I mean, you have the college scorecard. You do have a lot of good data on, what people are earning after they complete a degree or certificate using federal Title IV funding. But could you tell us a little bit about, how the landscape of federal data infrastructure has evolved? And, in your role as chief economist at the Department of Education, where do you envision this going over the next 5 years, particularly as this new accountability system is implemented, which is going to require a lot of earnings data on a lot of programs?
Yeah, no, thanks, Preston. So I can tell you how we are different, at least in the Trump administration, than some of the state data and their policies around them. So when you read this paper, you will see that there are several institutions that are producing negative ROI. They aren't named. So here we have evidence of institutions that are harming students, and they aren't providing a good return. But we don't name them. And I assume that they aren't named in this because this is sort of the policy. There's well, let's keep all of this quiet. The schools won't participate if we don't, if we agree to name names. In the Trump administration, we're perfectly happy to name names. If your institution is providing a low return on investment, we'll put that right on the FAFSA, right? And so I know this is great data, and this is really important, but why not name the institution? I mean, I think that's what we want to know here. So, that's something we're willing to do on the FAFSA. We're also collecting We have a new bill that was just enacted, the Working Families Tax Cut Act, which now imposes an earnings test for the first time on all degree programs. Now, David was talking about the connection with public policy, the way they use the data. I think is sort of much more, I guess it's much more complicated, right? It's formula funding. So the policymakers behind the scenes know which institution that isn't paying off. And then they write a formula and they direct the dollars the way that they want to based on this. To me, that seems less transparent than what we're trying to do at the federal level with something like the Working Families Tax Cut Act, where we'll publish what the students are earning at a program. You can see it for every program. And this data is coming. This is required under the law. And if they don't meet the benchmark, they don't get any more student loans. It's not a complicated formula with 15 different moving pieces that nobody understands. It's you get the loans or you don't. So it's more transparent, it's more simple, and I think that's what people voted for. That's why people voted for the Trump administration. They want that approach. They want you to name the institution.
Sure. So I'd love to dig a little bit more into some of the findings in this study. Do we still have the clicker?
We do, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Could you go back to slide 10, please? The one with the math achievement on it. Can we get that back up?
I wonder if our friends over there might be able to do this a little better than I can.
If we could. So while we're figuring that out, I'll just kind of start talking about this. But so this finding, really stood out to me as something that was really interesting. I mean, a lot of the stuff in this study, we have other evidence to, that's great. That's exactly the one I wanted. Thank you. So we know, college pays off most of the time, but there's big variation between different fields of study. Your study confirms that for us. But this is something that I think may be new to some folks. So what I want to point out about this panel on the right, about high school math test scores, this is not just saying that people who do well in math tend to earn higher wages than people who don't do well in math, although that is true. This is also saying that if you do well in math and then you go to college, you will be much better off than people who also did well in math but did not go to college. So in other words, the amplification effect of college on earnings is much stronger for people in this top quartile of high school math test scores, which I think is kind of interesting. I mean, it is still positive for people with lower math test scores, but the real value of college is really coming from these folks at the top of the math score test distribution. So I'd say, Whitney, I'd love to go to you first for this. Was this something that was surprising to you? Could you say a little bit more about this finding and just how you interpret this?
Yeah, Preston. So, I mean, this was really striking to us too, and it raised a bunch of questions for us. So, why might you see this pattern here? One question we had was, okay, could it be due to the types of institutions students are going to? Is it the case that if you have high math scores from high school, you're going to go to an institution that happens to just have really high returns, and it does that for all students regardless of their math achievement? And if we saw that those students at the upper end of the math distribution were just more likely to do that, it really could be driving this pattern. So to what extent is this really being driven by institution? And what we found for the bachelor's degree seeking students was about half of this seems to be driven in part by institution. Now that said, there are still differences within institutions. We do see that within an institution, students with higher math scores do better than those with lower math scores. So there's obviously something else there, and what is that other something else? I think there's a lot of hypotheses about what that could be. One, it could be that they're more likely to complete a degree, and that's why they're getting more returns. Two, it just could be that spending time in college, they're just able to benefit from the educational opportunity, and so they're getting more returns in the labor market just from that. It could also be program, though, too. And we did not look specifically at program, but that's something I think we should certainly do in the future. But if it's the case that these students with higher math scores are just more likely to go into these programs where we see high returns, that's the other thing that could be going on in the background here.
Fascinating. Zach, I'd love to get your reaction to this one, too. So, I mean, this kind of goes back to what you talked about at the beginning, that there's this question of how much of the value of college is due to the individual versus how much is due to the institution and program. that you're seeing. I mean, what do you make of these results? If we're getting back to this question of, is it a good idea financially for me to go to college? Should I be thinking more about whether I've got a good math score? Should I be thinking more about which institution, which program I'm attending? Just what do you make of these results?
Yeah, so the final point that Whitney made here, I think, is really crucial. So remember that these math scores are used directly in admission, both across Texas universities, but then also specifically across different programs. So for example, if you want to study engineering at Texas A&M, you're going through a different admissions process than the typical students who are enrolling at that university, let alone some other institution. I think what probably almost wholly explains this spectrum is the fact that these relatively lower math scoring students not only are enrolling at lower value programs, but have to enroll at lower value programs because the way Texas admissions policy works, those students just have a lot less access to the highest value programs in the state. And so I think, on the one hand, for individuals, students should look at this and say, wow, whatever programs these high math testing students are going into, they seem to be providing tremendous value to those students. I should probably, to the degree possible, seek those programs out. But from the perspective of the policymaker, I think this finding is really interesting because the policymaker should be thinking, okay, the way that we've organized our higher education system seems to not be providing very much value to low math score students. That's a choice. They don't have to organize higher education that way. And I think it'd be really interesting for Texas to think through, what if we were to try to either, say, increase funding to the schools that enroll relatively lower testing students, or change the kind of educational opportunities available to those students? It might be of interest to equalize this playing field. It might not be, right? There's sort of a question of like, who benefits the state most by educating the most? And right now, I think what this spectrum shows is that Texas is putting a lot more effort into educating very high math testing students. To those students' benefit, and maybe to the benefit of the state. I think that's sort of a key open question in this space.
Well, we're lucky enough to have a Texas policymaker on stage here. So, David, I'd love to get your reaction. What do you make of this?
What I make of it is it leads to access to programs of study in high skill, high demand, high wage jobs. I do want to comment on Jason's comment. Texas is courageous, and we are very transparent with data. While this report did not provide institutions, we have everything in Excel downloadable form by institution, by program. So just know that Texas prides itself in transparency, and so that you can have that data at your fingertips. The goal here is we're making sure that we're putting our mouth where our money's at. Why are we funding programs of study that are not producing value? And so that's what we're trying to do. So when I see this, I think we have to do a better job through K through 12 to get people math ready and enhancing their skills so that they can be ready for college, but also not gearing them towards liberal arts and other areas where it's not as high demand in Texas, so we can meet the appetite of our employers, because that's one of our main stakeholders. We have to make sure we have an educated workforce. So if we restructure this, so we're using this data to really understand how we can work with TEA in K through 12 to help them have a better pipeline of more high-skilled math competencies so that they can get into those majors.
Jason.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of a Rorschach test here in these findings, right? And I think we're kind of getting at it. Both Zach and David were talking about this. Is when you look at this, there's a group of people that will say, these programs, these STEM programs have a high payoff, and these liberal arts programs have a low payoff. And so therefore, we should subsidize more government money for the programs with the high payoff. We're here at the American Enterprise Institute. And I'm sure there are people here that would say, no, it's the other way around. You shouldn't subsidize a program that already pays off. It pays for itself. Why does it need more government money? And there are, and I'm sure there are many of my friends on the left would say, well, these education programs don't lead to the return, which is why we need to subsidize them more, so more people will do them. I think that, I think one of the things where this gets a little bit muddled in the methodology here in this study is that we're measuring the return on investment with the net price that the student pays. So I realize that this is student-focused. So this is, does this pay off for the student? Well, part of what makes it pay off for the student is the government has kicked in money. And So you actually, the way this formula is set up is that the more the government subsidizes it, the more it pays off. And so you're almost just sort of measuring the amount of government subsidy and whether or not the education pays off, which I think is not really the approach we want. And so I think that's something sort of more for sort of the field to discuss when they and sort of think through when they see these things. Does that mean we should have more subsidy or less? And how, maybe in our approach on the return on investment, that we should be excluding the money that the government has kicked in to try to figure out, what is this worth for both parties, the taxpayer and the student?
Yeah, Steve, do you have a response to that?
Great point, Jason. I'll just add an additional one, which is buried in which is sort of beyond the reach of today, which is the large majority of the cost to students. And this is not a discriminant anything you're saying, Jason, are the foregone earnings or these opportunity costs. It's the disruption to the wage patterns of enrollees because they're in school. That was a striking finding. It's a very large majority, for example, of associate's degree students. When you watch that curve dip, the primary thing that's going on is to some degree the net price they're paying, Jason, with the complexities of the choices we made there, but it's primarily because they're disrupted from employment. And just one other thing I'll say as an old K-12 educator, when I look at those green dots, I think there's a message for high schools to get better. That's my Rorschach painting for this one, everyone, which is let's just take the people on the left and move them up.
Yeah.
And that's a high school issue.
So I want to shift gears a little bit here. So Jason, I want to go back to you actually. So right now, I mean, not as we speak, but next week, the Department of Education's Negotiated Rulemaking Committee is going to take up a big draft regulation to overhaul the way that the federal government regulates accreditors. And one of the things that is in that draft is to tell accreditors, you need to start looking at measures of student achievement, including economic return on investment. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about, the department's priorities when it comes to, having accreditors look at this kind of thing more. Is it the goal that hopefully more accreditors will do things like this to figure out, which institutions are paying off, which programs are paying off? Tell us a little bit more about how the department is thinking about this potential new requirement on accreditors to look at ROI.
So you've reminded me that the department is engaged in active rulemakings and proposed rules that are not final, and we are still welcoming comments for how we should shape and change and finalize those rules. So in terms of accreditation, I mean, I think what you're seeing is the administration's commitment to trying to infuse measurements of earnings and student outcomes in every part of the federal policy. So not only is it in the Working Families Tax Cut Act, where programs gain or lose eligibility to student aid based on earnings, but there's also an intention to put that into the other pieces of eligibility for institutions, such as accreditation. Now, the agency has less control over what accreditors use, but there's the sort of acknowledgement that this is where we would like to see things go.
So Whitney, I'd love to go to you next. So you've done this fantastic study, 100 pages, lots of charts. You can read them all on the website. For you, what are the big unanswered questions that you have after doing this research? I guess if Stieg were to come to you and say, Whitney, I'd love to do round 2 of this, which hopefully he will. What are the places you'd like to go next with this?
Yeah, we have a long list, so I'll just hit on some of the highlights, I think. I think that one thing we would like to push on is the use of these measures for individual institutions and thinking about how to use those thoughtfully. So some of the questions that we have are, how stable are these measures over time? And that's important because we have a long time horizon for our follow-up periods, right? So we're looking at, by the time 15 years hits, it's been a long time. And that could be a very good signal of how an institution is doing, or it could be a pretty noisy signal. And so I think something that we would really like to push on is thinking about how stable are they over time? To what extent can you use these older cohorts to make inferences about current cohorts? Just because we think that's important for policymaking. That's one piece of it. I also think something else we've been thinking about is the follow-up period. So we designed these follow-up periods based on program length and cost, with typically going for shorter lengths for programs like credentials, or rather for degree types that are shorter, and going for longer ones that are longer. But there's another question in the background here, which is, really what we want to be doing is figuring out at which point you can make inferences about long-term outcomes. And it could be the case that, for example, for bachelor's degree students, we could do that a lot earlier than we are right now, right? We have a 15-year follow-up period. Could be that you could do that by year 12 or year 11. So that's something else we'd really like to push on, is trying to figure out at what point can you reliably predict long-term outcomes, and setting the periods for that. So for certificates too, that's something else we're thinking about, is does it need to be longer to really know if these are gonna pay off or not? So those are a few things we'd like to do next. I mean, I could go on and on, but I'll cut it there.
So we're going to get to questions from the audience in just a few minutes here, but I'd love to give kind of a similar question to the rest of the panel here. What are the big things we do not know, actually, about college return on investment that, I don't know if you're going to give Whitney a to-do list, you don't have to do that, but if there's a big unanswered question where you'd say, man, it would really be great to have some rigorous research to answer this question, I guess what would that be? Zach, do we want to start with you, and maybe we can go down?
Yeah, so to me, the key next step in this work is trying to get the forecast coefficient right, which is to say, okay, like we've got this great methodology. There's a lot of variation in exactly how the matching works, exactly how we construct counterfactuals. How can we use available quasi-experimental evidence on what happens when kids actually switch between programs to try to fine-tune this methodology, to get us to the point where we really feel confident that if kids were to move between any two of these arbitrary programs, then we'd be able to get a forecast coefficient of 1. It would actually change their wages to the degree these measures lead us to expect. And I think there's important work that could be done there that, after which we just could have sort of, in a sense, complete confidence that we actually now have these measures. We can start making changes to program availability, to funding availability, we could start thinking about substantially expanding program sizes, because these are high-value programs. They should be educating more students than they already are. So I think there's sort of the key next step is really just nailing down, we have so much confidence in the program-specific estimates that we're putting forward that we can name names and start really making important decisions on these bases.
Jason, David, I mean, you guys are kind of in the policymaker chair as you guys are thinking about your roles. I mean, what are the big unanswered questions, the data points, the phenomena that you would love some more clarity on, that you would love answered?
Well, really quickly, would love to see this for the grad programs. Since only undergrad, we know that's an area where there's been a lot of concern about low ROI because of the high prices and high debt. And then I just would also, reiterate what I said before. It would be good for, I think, the field to think through more clearly and say up front, what do we do when it's a high ROI program? Do we subsidize it less or more? And what do we do when it's a low return program? Does that mean we subsidize it less, or do we subsidize it more? It'd be good to have more of a kind of a broader conversation, have people kind of a set of thinking around that.
And for me, I think about how can we move the field to talk about economic security. I think 15 years is too long. Texans want to know what is the immediate impact it's going to have on their life for short term, and then thinking about long term later. I also am really intrigued about regional differences in the state of Texas. I always talk about it would be great to live in Connecticut where you can drive across the state in a couple hours versus you drive in Texas, you're still driving that, and it takes many, many hours. So I want to understand sort of the economic vitality of metro areas versus rural communities to really figure out how we can support all Texans and how those differentials of cost of living vary based on where you reside in Texas. So we're committed to working with Mathematica and STIG for the next 2 years to take even further analysis and really make this transparent for all stakeholders involved.
STIG, what about you? What are your next steps here?
We're taking notes. I agree with all of it. I'll just add 2 things. One is, as I mentioned before, decomposing these estimates by completers and non-completers is crucial. Remember, it's really important. You're looking at averages for groups of students who enter college, and in some cases, a large majority of them don't finish. And imagine what happens to these numbers when we come back and tell you for groups of students who finished and didn't, this is how they moved to different sides of these averages. One other thing, and this is this will be a bit vague, but I can portend it, and Jason, this will tie back to federally. One order of business, which Zach can account for, is first of all trying to verify that these estimates, which are based on quasi-experimental scalable methods, actually arrive at roughly the same conclusions as Zach and tenured economists do when they run really experimental designs. There's another thing that can happen, perhaps, which is when we do this study in multiple states, we might be able to get to a point where we can correlate up to the world you live in, Jason, and see if these estimates actually line up with the estimates you're hidebound to build based on much less data, doing all the great work federally. So the really important problem, which is imagine running our robot, let's call it, which is very intelligent in state data, next to the best robot we can build that runs on federal data to see if they come to the same answers. We could then arrive at a world where we have a lot of confidence and can really get behind estimates that run on publicly available data, which is just naturally always going to be less nuanced. So that's another horizon ambition that we have with this work.
Fantastic. So we are going to turn it over to the audience for questions at this point. So we have a few ground rules. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. An RA will come around with the microphone and allow you to ask the question. Please don't start speaking until you get the microphone so we can all hear, and if you're online, we can hear that. The other ground rule is make sure that you actually ask a question. We do not want to hear, this is more of a comment than a question. We will kick you out, or at least I will shut you down. We will not kick you out, but we may have Joe beat you up. But we will, and if you are online, please submit your questions to Richard. His email address is listed on the event page, and if there is an online question that comes in, Richard will raise his hand and he will ask that for us. So let's start with the in-person audience here. Who has a question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Jessica Blake with Inside Higher Ed. I was listening to a podcast last night that I never expected to hear higher ed come up in. It's a religious podcast called The Holy Post, and the earnings test came up, and they were talking specifically about the data that's showing that religious institutions and religious studies programs might be affected by the Department of Education's cutoff and the line. And they brought up this question that didn't come up today, and I'd like to hear a response to, which is it just economic value that we should be looking at? Or are there other dimensions of the value of an education that aren't being measured that we should be looking at? Whether they be societal impact, the more traditional liberal arts aspect of it creates a better, more informed citizen. So should those things be measured, and how might we look at measuring those factors?
Jason, do you want to take that one since it's about the earning test?
Sure. I want to point out in terms of the earnings test, now this is a proposed rule. It hasn't been finalized, but we're also implementing a law that was passed, so some of these things are in statute. But this earnings test is whether or not you can get loans. And so this isn't whether or not you can have a program, whether or not you can get federal grant aid. This is loans. And so I think the connection, I think this is probably what Congress was thinking when they passed the law, is that the connection between earnings and getting a loan is much tighter and much more justified than it is necessarily for grants, because you need the earnings to pay back the loan. We do have in the proposed rule in the regulatory impact analysis, there are countless tables, and I am absolutely sure that we made one in there that shows the share of failing programs that are going to fail the earnings test at predominantly religious institutions. So you could look in that for more details.
Excellent. Yes, Aaron.
Thank you. This question is actually about the future of K-12 accountability and how, if we build durable infrastructure among these three systems, how that could be potentially leveraged for CCMR. Thinking about how Perkins and WEO are becoming, more of a joint effort, hopefully. I'd like to hear the panel respond to, should K-12 be part of this conversation about which schools are preparing students to do well in the workforce, not just as a college-going matter, especially with the Perkins dimension.
David, do you want to take that one?
Oh, God, I get the easy questions. I think with the tri-agency working, so I can't speak upon behalf of Texas Education Agency and K through 12, I can just speak about how we're working with them on how we can create a feedback loop of information for high schools and others on the outcomes of their students, whether they do decide to go to college, whether they go to the military, whether there are other avenues. And so just creating that transparency for their commissioner to consider how they can change, modify policy and state law to help increase access and ability for all Texans in the K through 12 pipeline. So that's what we're trying to do. We're also trying to be transparent with, we have something called T3, which is we follow students from 8th grade until they hit into workforce. And we have a very clear Sankey diagrams that help understand the flow of what's happening to students. You can break it out by middle school and high school. And so really trying to understand, and what we want to do is add layers of reading and math readiness and understand how those pipelines close out based on the types of skills and learning that you're having in the K through 12. So more to come on that.
Excellent. Yes, in the back.
Thanks so much for a great conversation. I was wondering if you could walk me through the consequences of the following hypothetical for this conversation in the report. Say the administration were to somehow solve for disparate impact related to degree requirements connected to jobs, that is to say, eliminate degree requirements altogether and move to a skill-based hiring model. What would happen if that were to be true? And I guess maybe related to that, what would happen too if the administration reformed education level requirements attached to SOC codes, et cetera, that I'm assuming sort of inform the data and the methodology behind that? I hope those two hypotheticals make sense. Just kind of curious to understand the consequences of how then the value add would be measured, if at all.
Yeah, so how much of the value add is due to the degree, and how would the value add change if we were to go to a more skills-based hiring system where it's not necessarily you're hiring because of the degree, but you have a way to measure the skills and you're hiring because of that. Zach, would you want to try to address this one?
I can speak a little to that, because it should be emphasized that firms can hire however they want, and so like whether or not they require a degree is their own choice. We don't have great evidence just because firms have put so much emphasis on degrees, on hiring in the past, of what would happen if firms paid less attention. I think the fact that firms have paid so much attention to the degrees earned by potential candidates for jobs provides itself a lot of information about the value of the signal of that information and presumably, at least to some degree, the value of the underlying education that is evinced by the degrees that people receive. So I can't really imagine a policy change that would lead firms to deviate from what they seem to believe is already an optimal strategy for them to select between candidates, which is in part using the available information provided by degrees to hire candidates who are best suited to the jobs at hand.
But in Texas, we actually have created legislation that requires all four-year systems to create at least one high-demand competency-based bachelor's degree. So the path has started, and I think it's going to increase over time to really think about competencies and moving beyond the sort of traditional way that we've provided higher education.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
Hi, Michael Bettisworth with Texas State Technical College, Texas in the house. The federal data that's coming for Do No Harm, we're really excited about that. That will provide a level of transparency we've never had. Preston, I'm getting to the question. To make it actionable for our colleges, we really need to see it at the campus level and at that 6-digit SIP level. We have 12 welding programs at our colleges, and so the ability to see which one of them across a region is doing better or worse is so critically important. How can this data and this work extend to do that? Is UI the sole way of doing that, or can federal data also be used to get to that level of detail within small record size?
Jason, federal data question, I think that's yours.
The proposed rule and approach will be to produce the earnings data at the 6-digit SIP, the SIP code, right? The classification of instructional programs. This is our way of defining what is a welding program. The most granular level is a 6-digit, so that's an actual very narrow program of study. So the earnings data will be, the test will be administered at that level, and the data will be published at that level. We have not published data at that level before, the earnings data that does exist on the college scorecard and in a data set that was used to inform that rulemaking on the department's website was all done at the sort of 4-digit SIP level. But I'll say also, one of the big challenges when you move to this sort of super granular level of a program of study, which I always think is just to show you how granular it is. I think when I look at the data, I see, oh, it's a music performance major in woodwinds versus strings, right? That's how granular we are. So once we do that, we have very small cell sizes. And we have to start aggregating cell sizes in order to get big enough to get over the privacy restrictions. So there's a real trade-off in trying to get really granular with these program sizes, but totally understand what you're getting at.
Excellent. Yes, sir, over here.
Hi, Thomas Wise. This is for the post-secondary commission team. I really appreciate this nuanced analysis of the college wage premium from the perspective of demographics, the major, the degree. There's obviously value in a college degree, but I'm curious, separating out how much of that comes from signaling competency, being the way that firms are signaling competency and filtering applicants, and how much of that is actually the most optimal way to get skills. So one layer that I'm curious about seeing in future studies, and I don't know if this is in the larger study, is modality. So, for a 4-year standard degree compared to an online format or an accelerated bachelor's degree, what is the difference in the, that college wage premium? Because I have a feeling, even though there is a return, that if the sector was open to more innovation, that there would be a greater return with reduced costs in more innovative formats of delivery. And so I'm just curious to hear if that's going to be, implemented in future parts of the study.
Steve, Whitney, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, right? To what extent might modality of the degree change the returns to the degree? It's something that I think we would need to track that pretty carefully. This is a David question in part. I don't know that I'm especially aware of what Texas has done to sort of track this over time. But no, I take the question. I think it's a great one, and I'd love to get some descriptive evidence about that, right? So it's really just a question of, can we get the data? Is it something that, do we have enough cohorts that have gone through different changes in modality, right? Because that's the other issue, is there are delays, and if this change was pretty recent, in the last 5 to 10 years, we would have to wait a little while to get the final results. So, but I think it's a great question.
And I'll just add, we're not taking a position here about whether those curves are optimized. We're describing them as they've existed historically. I'm personally very open to the idea that all of those curves should be much higher, because colleges need to innovate through new designs, including new modalities. We're not studying that here. We watch students enter. We measure as best we can the effect of that choice. But those two wheels can connect with good data. Smart institutions like TSTC will take this data and run it right back to their constant quest to innovate. And one of our prevailing interests as an accreditor is to work with institutions that can take those curves and just shift them in shocking ways to the north. But that's a design question. What we're doing here is just observing the phenomena as it exists already.
All right, I think we are just about at time, so please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. All right, so we now have a 15-minute break, I believe. There's coffee and refreshments outside. Please be back here at 11 o'clock for our next panel. It's going to be a great one.
Thank you so much.
Yay.
Steve, thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much.
Good, yeah.
Whitney, thanks. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
was 800 pages long.
That sounds right.
Hey, how you doing? Good to see you, Mark. Okay, thank you. Hey, how you doing? Hey, I'm doing good, man. Good to see you. How's Tikas? I'm excited about Jen. Yes, she's going to do a great job. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask that everyone take their seats so we can get started again. I love the enthusiasm, but I would love to get started with this panel if everyone could please take their seats. Thank you so much for coming back with us. Again, it is so exciting to be in a room full of people who are excited about the same things that I am. So thank you for being here and thanks for your enthusiasm. I am thrilled to welcome to the stage our last panel for today. I'm happy to call both of these men friends and obviously very important, influential people in higher education policy reform in the past decade. So first, let me introduce Undersecretary Nicholas Kent. In his current role, he oversees the Department of Education's post-secondary education, career, technical, and adult education, and federal student aid programs. He most recently served as the Deputy Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia under Governor Glenn Youngkin. He was previously the Chief Policy Officer at Career Education Colleges and University and Director of Policy Planning and Research at the DC office of the State Superintendent of Education. He holds a master's degree in higher education administration from the George Washington University. We also have, to his right, former Undersecretary James Cavall. In his current capacity, he's Vice President of the National Program at Carnegie Corporation of New York. In his role, he helps to shape and execute Carnegie's national strategy to strengthen education and democracy in the United States. He served as Undersecretary of Education at the department from 2021 through 2025, and he was previously the president of the Institute for College Access and Success, a Towsley Foundation policymaker in residence at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council from 2013 to 2016. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here to be part of this conversation today. We want to continue the discussion started earlier today about the direction of reform, accountability, and the integration of data in this process. And so one of the comments I made in my remarks to start the day, and also in a paper I published just about a week ago now, was that we're now in what I'll call the era of accountability, era of value-based accountability, I should say. We've moved through access to higher education kind of being the buzzword du jour, through completion, through the affordability period of time. And I would argue that we have really arrived in this new era in which value-based accountability is the center of thought leadership, policy reform, and just the direction of where we're headed. So one, true or false? I'm kidding. There's more to that. But I would love to hear your reaction to that. I mean, do you agree and share this sentiment that we have evolved through these other stages, but that is an apt description of where we are today? And I'd love for both of you to respond to that.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I was kind of hoping that's where you would end with. It'd be my easiest panel all week. The answer is yes, but I think that you have to unpack and ask, like, why? Mm-hmm. And the why is because Americans are growingly skeptical of higher education. Mm-hmm. You know, a recent Gallup poll showed that only about a third of Americans believe that college is valuable today. Mm-hmm. You know, in a recent Burning Glass Institute poll found that about 7 in 10 college graduates enter jobs where they don't need a college degree or that their college degree doesn't align with their studies. Mm-hmm. and then couple that with the growing cost of higher education, which I hope we talk about today. Americans are skeptical, and the value proposition is undoubtedly in question. And so Americans are asking, what are they getting for the time and the resources and the taxpayer investment? And so this question about accountability is now at the forefront. I always say about every decade you find a buzzword, it's access, it's affordability, and I think right now we are at a time where we are focusing really intentionally about accountability. And we can talk about how the various administrations have approached that over the years, but I think we are converging at a time where whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, we're all saying, we invest a tremendous amount in our higher education system, and we expect something from it. And we're starting to really pinpoint and I think narrow our differences about how we're approaching accountability.
Nick, you mentioned that students are demanding something different today than they once were. When do you think that shift started?
I think that shift started over the last decade or so. I think that, as we see that graduates are entering marketplaces where the earnings don't align with, what they're taking on in student debt and the amount of time, the fact that we have a lot of credential inflation happening where, college students are spending more and more time in post-secondary education, people are asking themselves, what am I getting for this investment? And so I would say over the last decade, and to some policymakers' credit, they've been talking about this for a long time. Researchers have been talking for this for a long time. And so now I think the general public is coming around to this idea and demanding change in higher education.
Yeah, I agree. I've been yelling about this for a long time, and finally people are listening.
You wrote a book or two about it.
I might have. So I'm thrilled that they're listening, even if it took a long time. James, let me step back. I'll throw you back that softball that we started with here, which is, are we in this value era of higher ed thinking? And, how do you think we got here?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of things that people disagree on deeply right now, including Nicholas and me. So it is really nice to be here talking about an area where I think there's emerging agreement. And actually, I have a memory of being here at AEI, listening to a congressional staffer on a panel who said, you know what, student loans shouldn't leave people worse off than if they had never gone to college. And I was like, yes, I totally agree with that. And that seems like a foundational principle that we can really build on. Now, I'm perhaps a little more of a believer in higher education. Like I think that college degrees continue to have a lot of value. I think higher education has a lot of potential, not completely fulfilled, to solve some of our country's greatest problems. But I think that we are not going to get to rising living standards and greater equality of opportunity, the ability to understand each other a little better, without a strong higher education system. So I think that has to be one of our goals. I think unfortunately, historically, we've kind of taken a shortcut to investments in higher education, and we said, a college degree is worth $1 million, so what's the big deal if you ask students to take out $30,000 to pay for it? And now we just have a much richer understanding, thanks in part to the paper that was presented this morning, about when that's true and when that's not true. And there are circumstances in which the debt is really not an appropriate way to pay for college, and we need to be more consistently delivering on the promise to college so it's not as risky for young people.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm really glad that, you did mention the differences between parties here, because I think it's so important. And I often find that when we get down into the nuance, we often do agree. And so it sometimes takes a more detailed and thoughtful conversation. But I wonder, we won't talk about exactly what happened during the Biden administration on higher ed finance policy, because I'll just get my hair on fire about that. But let's talk a little bit about the parties and their differences and how they approach accountability, generally speaking, because the media is focused on where we differ, and I think it's so important and valuable both for the future and just for everyone's understanding of where we are today to see, where do we come together and where are those nuanced differences? And maybe, Nick, you can start and just think like, what is if you can speak for the position of the party that you're representing in your current position, what are the goals of accountability, value-based accountability, and where do you hope it goes forward from here?
I think it's twofold. We kind of look at higher education holistically right now, and thankfully through the Working Families Tax Cut Act, we're able to do that. We're able to re-envision our entire higher education system, everything from financing and manageable loan caps that we're putting into place starting on July 1, to standing up a new workforce Pell program that recognizes that the path to economic and social mobility doesn't always flow through a four-year degree, to a new accountability structure. So we're looking at the system holistically and not in pieces, which I think is really important when you're trying to make major reforms in higher education. How does this puzzle all fit together? And I would say arguably, unlike previous administrations, we're looking at things from the front end all the way to the back end. And what we're saying here is we want to empower students to understand what they are signing up for and what their potential investment and outcomes are. And so things like, instituting a new earnings indicator on the FAFSA, which my chief economist, Jason Delisle, who you all heard from this morning, talked a little bit about it. Making sure that students have critical information at critical decision-making times. We are also very interested in re-envisioning our Office of Ombudsman to focus on consumer education as well as student complaints, making sure that we're giving students as much information as possible. That way, when we get sort of to the end of the line and we say it's time to repay back your loans, we're not forgiving millions of dollars in student loans and burdening taxpayers with that. Students understand what the commitment is that they're signing up for and can make really informed decisions. I think that we've seen a lot of regulatory whiplash in the accountability ecosystem in higher education for 15 or so years. And I think what I am trying to do now is kind of bring us where that pendulum is stopping to swing. And so we went through a negotiated rulemaking process, which James knows is not the easiest thing in the world. And it is very challenging to get consensus among a variety of stakeholders who often do not disagree, or often disagree about what the path forward should be. And we reached a historic consensus on an accountability framework. And previous administrations, when they negotiated things like gainful employment, did not. And so our goal here is to say there is general agreement that accountability is really important in higher education, that we want students to be better off when they graduate, that they're earning more than what they normally would, and if they were just a high school graduate. And I think that we are starting to coalesce around this concept generally. And I think that we're going to see a path forward that hopefully for students and families and institutions, we kind of bring that pendulum to the middle and we stop swinging, and maybe we can actually have accountability that matters moving forward.
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
Let's keep working towards that. And so the ideas that I'm hearing from Nick are like, empowering individual students, right? So allow choice in the markets to police these institutions, as well as kind of coming to the middle on regulatory reform and, with kind of modest solutions, but I could potentially describe the changes coming from Congress last summer as really a modest step into holding institutions accountable for these labor market outcomes. Now, James, I know you don't represent the DNC here today, but maybe you can kind of pretend to represent, or kind of pull together what you know about the thinking that's happening amongst Democrats right now. I mean, how does that differ, and where does it bump up against, or where does it, buttress what Nick has just described?
Yeah, I think the concern with higher education from the left has often focused on the problem of student debt. And the truth is that we are making a lot of loans that we know students are going to struggle to repay. And there are a lot of people who have loans that are struggling to repay, as I think we're all watching, more and more people default as they're returning to repayment. And so that's a very serious policy challenge. And I think the steps to try and identify at the front end what loans aren't going to pay off and try and cut those loans off is a really important step forward. And you could debate whether we have the metric exactly right. You could argue whether the loan limits were designed correctly in all circumstances. But I think the idea of saying like, look, there's a lot of these loans that don't pay off and we need to cut them off. I give Congress and the administration a lot of credit for taking a step forward there. And I don't think we're going to go back. I think one question that we should confront is, are there some of these programs that are good programs, even if the loans don't pay off? So, if you look at what these programs are, large numbers of them, students appear to be trying to get a job. So there are a lot of low-performing business majors, dentistry schools, other types of professional degree programs that really are not doing well on these metrics. And maybe we don't feel so bad about that. But there is also some programs that struggle to perform on the metrics because they prepare people for public service professions, that they prepare people for human professions that maybe you could consider public service, but things like divinity or theater or the arts, or prepare people that often struggle in labor markets because they're people of color, or they're first gen or low income. And so, I think we need to think about accountability as a way of addressing the lowest performing programs that with humility we can say we know students have better options. But we also need to think about a strategy where how do we improve programs in colleges, that are serving goals other than economic returns to the student, and B, that are performing similar to other colleges and universities, but still not performing well enough. And if you cut off financial aid to every school with a 60% graduation rate, you'd be cutting off half the sector.
Right.
So we need another strategy beyond just eligibility ties to try and improve those outcomes.
I'm glad you said that. That was literally next on my list in terms of what I want to talk about. I mean, when I have been a champion of more strict accountability based on student outcomes, this is the number one thing I hear. What about the social workers? What about the teachers? There are occupations that serve the public good in a very serious way, and they tend to be lower wage occupations that may get caught up in either the current version or future versions of accountability reform. And it sounds like, James, you're saying this is a bit of a hang up for Democrats when it comes to moving forward with any sort of more aggressive accountability policy. And I wonder how we grapple with that, because it is a real problem that there are positive externalities, as an economist would describe it, to some of these majors that are not measured by a values-based accountability standard. And yet at the same time, in order to serve as an actual functioning consumer protection, we don't want to disguise the low returns that are inherent in these occupations. So, I mean, I wonder how both of you, could respond to, like, how do Democrats say, grapple with, this being something that hinders them from wanting to move forward more ambitiously with accountability, or where do we go, given that that is a tension that I think both parties recognize? I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
I'll take a first swing. One is when you're defining the minimum standards, you want to look very carefully at the numbers. And we looked at making sure that students would continue to have choices. So whatever profession you wanted to go into, whatever your student demographic was, the vast majority of programs serving you remained eligible. And I think that is important. And I imagine Nicholas did the same. I also think there's a strategy for delivering better value for students in the states that we don't talk about enough in DC. And if you look at the efforts to serve their communities, enroll large numbers of students, help them graduate and get jobs, what's happening in Florida and Georgia and Texas is pretty similar to what's happening in California and New York. There's taking responsibility for the success of students and no longer trying to weed them out. There's efforts to identify who's struggling and what are the obstacles to those, often very mundane and prosaic, bureaucratic hangups and trying to use data to continuously improve those outcomes and place people in jobs in the local economy. And you can call that equity, you could call it workforce development, you could call it upward mobility, but really we have the same goal and we are using the same tactics and we're getting results. And so, I would like to see a national conversation around value in higher education that reflects that broad consensus that, that is working.
And are these parallel conversations, or is this one conversation that has to happen?
I think that, you mean the accountability and the improvement?
Yeah, yeah.
I
mean, the accountability has this deficiency, right, of potentially leaving somebody, something, some region behind, right? And it does seem like some impediment to moving forward and garnering current support from Democrats on this issue may be, these conversations not happening at the exact same time. Do you think that's appropriately characterizing it?
Well, I don't want to monopolize this panel. Nicholas is the person whose opinions actually matter these days.
Don't worry, I got some hard ones for him coming too.
But I would say that the issue of measurement gets trickier as you move up. So I think we can all agree that a program where, large numbers of students are defaulting, single digit graduation rate, that's a bad program, whatever it's trying to achieve.
Yeah.
But I think it's harder to say that a program that, a liberal arts college, there's some very selective, prestigious liberal arts colleges that have relatively low earnings, a divinity school, arts programs, we just have such tremendous variety. And then you also have the challenges, I understand, there's an attempt to make it with the paper today, but there's just so much unobserved selection happening in a higher education system. It's a real methodological challenge to identify really the quality of an individual program or institution when they're choosing their students, the students are choosing them. There's just a lot going on. So so I don't think it's a question of taking the metrics that the Obama administration or the Trump administration started and just kind of ratcheting them up. There needs to be it's a much more challenging conversation.
Yeah. So let's step back, Nick, in terms of what is the current administration's take and how to grapple with these things, that there are public service occupations that, further accountability could potentially leave behind.
I appreciate everything that James said, and we do agree on a lot. But when you start to parse out, some of these professions that he talked about, whether it's teachers or sociologists or journalists or those who go into religious-based occupations, then the question remains well, who's left then to hold accountable, right? And I think what we have to realize is that students are struggling. And Beth, you said it perfectly at the outset. What we are proposing in our rule and what Congress has directed us to implement is a pretty low bar.
Yeah.
It is a pretty low bar. And I don't care if you're a teacher or you're a sociologist or name your public service profession. When you sign up to go into higher education and you're taking on debt, you want to leave with a better job than the one that you had. And you expect to earn a certain amount of money. And if you can't get there 4 years after you graduate, taxpayers should be asking the question, what value are you actually getting? So I think what we're asking institutions to do is to meet a pretty low bar.
Yeah.
We are in a public relations crisis in higher education. And I think higher education is very well aware of this. The main lobbying group, ACE, I think, spent the last year, God only knows how many millions of dollars on this campaign that, higher education builds America, right? I think what we really should be talking about is student debt is killing the American dream. And what are we going to do about it? That's what we should be talking about. And part of that conversation is about holding institutions accountable, getting the cost of higher education down. Unlike previous administrations, we're not interested in targeting certain types of programs.
Right.
We are interested in holding all of higher education accountable. And as Jason had mentioned today, we're very comfortable naming and shaming because it's working. You know, there was a Chronicle piece published, I think, last week with the University of California at Irvine is reducing some of their graduate level courses by upwards of 30%. Purdue came out with something a couple of weeks ago. They're doing the same. You know, Santa Clara Law School reduced their law school tuition this year by $16,000, right? So what we are doing is actually working, and the bill hasn't even taken full effect yet.
Yeah.
So we're very excited, but the reality is that we can have conversations about how do we support professions and who should support those professions. Should it be state appropriation? Should it be philanthropy? Should it be employers? But at some point, we have to ask ourselves, what are we getting for our limited federal investment? We have limited resources at the federal level. We want to make sure that we're investing in programs that provide the best return on investment for students and families and taxpayers.
Right, right. So James, you know, Nick alluded to, you know, this being the first time there was a universal standard that was not targeted to a particular sector. He's referring to the gainful employment regulations that in the past had largely affected the for-profit sector in higher education. I mean, what are your thoughts on the reform that moved us from there to where we are today? I mean, do you think that was the right step forward?
Yeah, I mean, I give the policymakers who did it credit for doing that. You know, I do think that when we started the gainful employment rule, you know, that was the first time we tried to implement an outcome-based threshold after, I guess, the cohort default rate. At that time, you know, people were not collecting earnings data.
Yeah.
When we wanted to think about what the impact of the rule would be, you know, we had one state that had program level earnings at the programs we were interested in, and spent endless hours debating whether, you know, one particular institution in that state was an outlier or whether it was in fact a nationally representative state. So, you know, we've come so far in the 15 years since we've had that conversation. Now, like, that rule focused on, you know, career and for-profit programs. That was a result of the legal authority the department had. You know, when people said, oh, we should do it by legislation instead, you know, I'd say, well, you know, it doesn't look like Congress is doing anything, so let's take this first step. And there's a lot of problems here, so it's a good place to start. I didn't really think that people were serious about Congress enacting a standard like that across the sector. I thought it was a way of deflecting. So, you know, the fact that it's happened, I'm pleasantly surprised, and I think it's a good step forward.
I mean, go ahead, Nick.
And I appreciate everything that James just said there, and, you know, being sort of the chief architect of this new policy. Thanks. But what I would say is what we're trying to achieve here again is a regulatory framework that actually lasts and takes effect. You know, despite, you know, James's hard work over the course of the last 15 years, you know, we had two versions of that rule under the Obama administration. It was completely rescinded during the Trump administration. The Biden administration brought it back. So we've had 4 iterations of this rule. Not one program has lost eligibility for funding as a result of these regulations, despite the fact that countless hours have gone into them.
Yeah.
Lots of lawyers have made money, but not one student has actually been protected.
Right, right.
And so the goal here under our administration is for these rules to take effect this summer, and for them to stay around long enough where we're actually going to hold programs and institutions accountable for the very first time. And my hope is that once we see this, you know, we'll iterate on it. You know, it's the first time that this type of holistic framework will have been around long enough to hopefully go into effect and see its outcomes. And maybe we will, you know, see Congress act in a few years that says, you know, this isn't the right bar. Maybe it needs to be ratcheted up a little bit. Maybe it actually needs to be a little bit harder. Maybe we need to expect more.
Yeah.
But I think, to James's point 15 years ago, this is the first step. And I am confident that our rule will go into effect and that we will actually see outcomes for the very first time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 15 years ago, attitudes were wildly different, right? I mean, it was seen as somewhat radical to even be thinking about measuring the primary outcome of higher education with student earnings. You know, we've come a long way, and Congress wasn't interested in doing anything at that time. And I think the shift in public sentiment paired with some other trends has kind of empowered lawmakers, happen to be Republicans this time, to make these really important changes. And given that shift, I wonder how you feel about our readiness to have really consequential policy now tied to federal dollars. I mean, gainful employment kind of nudged us towards this, but as you said, the consequences didn't go into effect. Are we ready now? Are data systems ready now? Are politicians, are the staff at the department ready to really, you know, to empower this legislation to have effects on institutions and really protect students in that way?
Well, I'll start off and say we are certainly ready. We are ready.
I kind of knew you were going to say
that.
Yeah,
we are ready. And you know, James and I were talking about this in the green room, and you know, the fact that we basically have done a reauthorization of higher education in less than a year is remarkable, which is why my team is not sleeping at night.
Thank you for that.
And yeah, so we have 3 big rules that are making their way through the process. We published one a week or 2 ago on the student loan system. We are about to publish a rule very soon on workforce Pell, and then soon thereafter we will close out with our new accountability framework. So we are absolutely ready. We are not only focusing on the policy, but the operation aspect. And you know, we are having conversations with institutions. Obviously, we're still in the rulemaking process and open to changes. My lawyers make me say that, but it's true. And but we're talking with policymakers. Listen, change in higher education is really hard, and nobody knows that better than the 2 people sitting here on the stage.
Absolutely.
Higher education is not meant to change. The status quo is what keeps everybody happy. And so whether you're talking about student loan caps or you're talking about accountability, there's always going to be somebody pushing against the current. But I think what we have on our side is the American people. The American people voted for change in the last election, and part of that was the elevation of the challenges in our higher education system. And so, you know, one of the things that I was really pleased to see is that when we came out with our accountability proposed rule, the vast majority of headlines were extremely supportive of holding institutions accountable and protecting students. So I think unlike, you know, previous years, the higher ed lobby, which is very powerful, is sort of the ones who are having to play catch up here, and I think that they are realizing that change is coming.
Absolutely. James, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that we're ready? You were previously in the hot seat that Nick is currently in. I mean, is the data ready for the challenge that we're putting to it with these new standards? Are institutions going to rise to this? Are lawmakers on Capitol Hill going to be able to stand up to their constituents when they come and complain about losing access to dollars?
You know, I think with respect to the do no harm standards, I do think people are going to be able to rise to the occasion, and there's a lot of tools that institutions have to meet those standards. As Nicholas says, they're not extremely challenging. You know, I think the debate over the loan limits for graduate programs, which to me is a kindred policy, is one where, you know, I continue to hear a lot of consternation and concern. You know, here too, you know, I would say that loans for graduate programs, master's programs, that was a big source of unaffordable debt that I think wasn't fully appreciated in the public dialogue. So I think it is commendable that this is something they've taken on. You know, I would have probably done it a little differently. I would have looked at the data on which of these loans pay off, and not like a philosophical discussion over what is professional and what is not. And I am, I think there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen this summer to a lot of these programs, especially institutions that are primarily graduate institutions are very worried. And I think there is, I've seen some receptivity in Congress to those concerns.
Sure, sure. So we talked a little bit about, well, earlier today about state policy. Obviously, the report that was published today looked at data from the state of Texas, which we acknowledge is much stronger than the data that the federal government has the ability to utilize. We also talked about students being a vehicle for accountability because they can vote with their dollars if they're empowered with information. And obviously, you two are, very familiar with the vehicle of federal policy as a vehicle for accountability. And I wonder, as you sit here and think about the next several years in accountability reform, I mean, where do you hope the movement continues? What aspect is the appropriate vehicle for moving the needle forward? And maybe it changes over time, maybe it doesn't. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Well, you think under the president's leadership, we're actually making real reforms in higher education. And part of that is getting the cost of higher education down. And we are doing that through the reasonable loan caps that James mentioned, including at the graduate level. I can appreciate other people would do it differently. I think that we got it right. I'm confident that we got it right. And that is because if you look at the federal student loan portfolio, the Federal Department of Education is responsible for $1.7 trillion in current federal student loan debt. About 25% of that debt is currently in default. Only about a third of students are actually making on-time payments. Millions are waterfalling through the system in delinquency on their way to default. At the same time, we know that in 2006, Congress took the guardrails off of graduate programs. And what ended up happening? The Bennett hypothesis ended up being true, right? And so we saw a spike in often worthless graduate programs. 43% of them are estimated to have a negative return on investment. So many of these graduate programs are not providing a good return on investment. And so that is where our focus has been. And I can appreciate that institutions are frustrated that they're going to have to live within their means, just like American families do, and that the gravy train is ending. But they've had since 2006 to enjoy those loans. It's time that we focus on students and not institutions and systems. At the same time, what I'm encouraged about at the state level are states like Indiana that are passing legislation, Governor Braun's legislation, that is actually doing the same thing. It's looking at both programs that are providing a poor return on investment, but also programs that have low enrollment. Indiana has identified like over 1,000 programs for merger, consolidation, elimination. And we're seeing the same thing in states like Utah.
That's right. As a proud Utahn, I'm really glad you pointed that out.
Utah, Florida, but states like New Hampshire and West Virginia that are looking at bills that are going to do the same. So I think states are starting to recognize that there's limited state appropriations. I say this as somebody who worked in a state. And we want to be putting our state money also towards programs that are providing the greatest return on investment. And that we are not allowing systems like tenured faculty to tell us that we need to keep a program around that's not providing a good return on investment for our students. So I'm really encouraged about the fact that states are taking a very similar but kind of different approach to figuring out which programs their state institutions should be offering and where they're going to put their state dollars.
Great. And James, how about you? What are you thinking?
I mean, I think when we think about how we should be financing higher education, there's a couple of things that we should be doing. One is we do want to cut off these bad performing loans, and we've talked a lot about that. The second is we want to be more consistently delivering value to students by raising graduation rates, improving career outcomes. There's a lot of work happening, and honestly, I think DC is a little behind the curve in that conversation. And then the third thing that we need to think about is what type of student loan safety net do we need for people that do not get the returns to college. So, I think we've all agreed 15 years ago, we said a college degree was worth $1 million, and we overlooked how wide the distribution was and how many people didn't get that.
Very true.
It wasn't even $1 million because it's not net present value. But so now we've broken it down by institution, by program, and so we do have like a lot more sophisticated understanding. But even if you're looking at the program level, there's still a distribution under there, and you have people that may become disabled or have misfortune in their life or whatever it may be. And so even if you are only allowing loans to go to programs that are consistently delivering value at the median, you still need some relief for those people that don't complete or that have some sort of misfortune in their life or for whatever reason didn't get the benefit of the bargain that they thought they were taking out a loan for. So that's something that we need to pay more attention to as well.
Okay, so next up, safety net. What do you hope for these standards that we have for institutions? Obviously, the do no harm standard, big step forward. What's the next step? I feel like James is going to say the safety nets that go with it for those who don't have access to degrees, but I'll let him answer that. And I'd love to hear you both just sort of tell me, what is your vision for how does accountability policy evolve over the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the things I just mentioned, I do think, Beth, I saw you wrote a paper on including price. And I think, the Obama and Biden approach was to take a look at debt. And, I would suggest that there's a clear core federal interest in whether the loans are affordable. A price to earnings ratio is a little more setting up the federal government as the arbiter of value overall.
Yeah.
But it has other strengths as well, so you could have that conversation. But I think you do want to introduce another dimension to your consideration of what is value in addition to earnings.
Okay, and so for you, really student loan debt and explicitly taking that into account, an accountability regime would be something that you'd be excited to see in coming years. Okay, how about you, Nick?
I think, I'll reinterpret what James just said, which is, some loans are unaffordable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sort of conceding the point that we are making loans to institutions or, to students who are enrolled in certain programs at institutions and are not providing a worthwhile investment. And then we say, well, we need to make change, and we're going to make change by instituting reasonable loan caps, and then people go crazy, right? And it's like, well, we all know what the perils of a student taking on unmanageable debt are.
Yeah.
But as I had mentioned, one of the things that we're focused on is not forgiving billions of dollars in debt. That's just not the mantra of this administration. What we are about is accountability across the higher education spectrum. And that means holding institutions accountable, programs accountable, borrowers accountable, and the system accountable. And the way that we hold the system accountable is making sure that students have as much information to make informed decisions at the beginning of their educational journey. I had mentioned the FAFSA earnings flag that we stood up last December. And that is having real behavioral change when we see students filling out the FAFSA, understanding what the potential earnings of a particular institution are on average, and actually making behavioral decisions as a result of that. That people are taking certain types of institutions off of their FAFSA list and putting other institutions on. So it's about making sure that students have as much information throughout the entire trajectory of their educational experience, because when we get to graduation day, that student has to understand that they have an obligation to pay back the system that gave them that opportunity, to make sure that we have a federal student loan system and a federal Pell Grant system that will be around for the next generation of students. Because right now, we have $1.7 trillion, and over 25% of that right now is in debt.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll ask you both one more question, and then I will invite the audience to participate in the conversation with us. So my observation on what we've seen in this movement over the past 2 decades was that we've seen pretty modest reforms happen incrementally, sometimes under Democratic leadership, sometimes under Republican leadership. And, there seems to be tremendous overlap in terms of the parties' positions, yet we're not getting them to work together on this issue. We're just kind of passing the moderate position back and forth between parties. What does the future of bipartisan cooperation look like on, for advancing accountability policy? I mean, do we have to continue to pretend that it's partisan and just make modest, moderate reforms under different leadership, and or can we actually come together and publicly agree on some of these things? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think hopefully, James and I being here together is sort of one instance of, us showing the American people that there are a lot of there's a lot of agreement, especially when it comes to accountability. I would sort of challenge Beth a little bit about what you said at the beginning.
Please.
The Trump administration doesn't know how to make incremental change. We know how to make big, rapid, fast change.
Okay.
And we're seeing that right now. But I think with regard to accountability, we are starting to narrow these differences. And I think that what we will be able to see moving forward is an accountability framework that stays around long enough to have an impact so that we can actually study what the results of it are. Anytime you make any major changes, whether it's accountability, and I talk about, the new workforce Pell program that we're standing up, and, people have difference of opinions about how that will work and whether Congress made it too complicated and how many institutions are ever really going to participate. And I remind people that change is incremental. We've been talking about accountability meaningfully for 15 years, and now we're finally getting somewhere. And so I think some of these programs are going to take a little bit of time to bear out, but I 100% agree with James on the fact that I don't think that we're going to move backwards.
That's great.
The thing that gives me hope is how much agreement I see in the broader higher ed community.
Yeah.
And the idea that, we should be welcoming all students who want to go to college. We should use data to figure out where they're getting stuck. We should pay attention to putting them in careers in the local economy and contributing to our country and achieving economic stability for themselves. There's broad agreement on a higher education system oriented around value in the states. And I don't think those are particularly ideological changes that we're trying to achieve. There's a lot of controversy, and our society seems to be in a moment where people want to argue about things, and the people on the far left and the far right get the most attention. And higher education's not immune from that.
Yeah.
But I am hopeful that there's a lot of progress that we can make together in the States and here in DC. I think there's a lot of fundamental agreement.
I agree. Okay, we have time for just probably a couple questions. Wait for a microphone to come to you, and then ask a brief question. Same ground rules, must be a question, must be brief. Here in the white jacket.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Thank you.
My name is Kieran Huang. I'm coming from New Hampshire Department of Education, but speaking on my behalf. As somebody who's involved in K-12 accountability, I'm curious about your thoughts on where you see the greatest opportunities for collaboration across K-12 and higher education for accountability metrics as well as school improvement practices. And what would you say are some of the challenges to that collaboration that states should be aware of?
One thing that I think is really interesting is the way that higher ed and K-12 are grappling with some of the same questions, but they don't talk to each other very much. So thanks for being here. And, I think one place you see that is in this debate of did we just have a college for all movement? And the higher education sector says, what do you mean? We always said people should go to community college or trade school or go directly into work. But I think there were a lot of people in K-12 who were interpreted college and career ready as sending as many of our students as possible into 4 years. So there was, I think, a bit of a disconnect. And now, just as higher education is saying, like, you know what, we really do need to better serve all these students, and we can serve better all these students, K-12 is starting to say, oh, wait, let's pump the brakes on four-year college and send more people into other kinds of things, which is not bad either. But I think that we do need to think together about how do we know what is a successful outcome, and when we're thinking about people that are not going through post-secondary education, you know, we're trying to achieve value and upward mobility for them as well. So can we extend the same kinds of metrics and think about the roles not just of individual institutions and programs, but our system as a whole working together to achieve that. And you know, I think we are going to need to pull together our higher ed and K-12 colleagues to really think that through in a way that makes sense, because the high school transitions piece of it is really important.
I think that I'm very excited about what James just said, because it's true. And from somebody coming from the Obama administration, which is really when we started this lie that the only path forward to economic and social success was a four-year degree, right? That we are coming around as a nation saying that that's not necessarily true. And I think what gives me a lot of hope coming from Virginia and paying a lot of attention to our K through 12 system and working with our accountability framework is that we are starting to build into K through 12 accountability frameworks like dual enrollment and like industry recognized credentials, and recognizing that we do not want our K through 12 students to be just focused exclusively on 4 years, right? And that's what this administration is all about. We're not here to say that a four-year degree is not valuable to some students, but we are here to say there are a lot of educational choice options that are available out there that the federal government has not put a flashlight on in decades.
Yeah.
And so, whether it's a community college or whether it's a short-term credential, as we build the Workforce Pell Grant program, we want to make sure that all students, including our middle school students and our high school students, realize the options that they have after they graduate high school.
Great. And we have another question. This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Greg Sheckman with Western Governors University. My question is, you were talking about states taking the steps of reducing low enrollment or low earnings programs from their various institutions. Do you think that values-based accountability is going to lead to more mergers and closures by publics and privates?
Yes. Yes, I say probably once a day that there are 6,000 institutions of higher education in this country, and not all of them are going to make it out of the next decade, and not all of them should. I think that we are seeing a move towards greater, not just mergers and consolidations, but also greater partnerships between regional comprehensive universities and community colleges, sharing back office services. I think people recognize that higher education institutions cannot operate in silos anymore, and they have to work together as a sort of holistic system. So I think that we will absolutely see greater mergers, acquisitions. The problem is the federal government makes that very cumbersome to do. It's something that I've spoken publicly about, that one of our next rulemakings, believe it or not, we're going to do more rulemakings, later this year, will focus on some of the other Title IV eligibility issues, including how can we ease the pain for institutions who want to engage in these really helpful conversations in a much more quicker, meaningful way. But yes, we're going to see more consolidations and mergers for sure.
Another question? I'll take a question from Preston.
Thank you. So accountability really strikes me as the classic, public choice problem of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. The costs of not having accountability fall on taxpayers, they fall on students, but the benefits accrue to institutions who, as Nick mentioned, have very powerful lobbies. And so is there a way that we can build a more durable political coalition in favor of accountability rather than necessarily relying on one line in a massive reconciliation bill in order to get our accountability system in there? Is there a way that we can change the politics here to make this more of a lasting political interest?
I mean, I'll start here and say I think the answer is yes. I'm not going to, well, I'll sort of name the organizations. Over the last couple of weeks, there were two organizations, one AEI, Preston, I think it was your article actually, came out with a very similar sort of an accountability stance as New America, right? Two different organizations, what people would think two different political parties, right? And if you laid those articles next to each other, there were a lot of commonalities between what we were saying here, which is accountability is important, accountability should be lasting, and times are changing. And I think, as I had mentioned, we're starting to see the American people really come around to that. When we put out our proposed rule, hundreds of headlines, and I would say, 98% of those were favorable towards holding institutions and programs accountable and protecting students. So I think we are seeing it already. We are seeing the durability of this start, which is that you have to have a coalition, and that coalition starts with the American people. I think people are tired of the higher ed lobby protecting poor-performing institutions and programs. I think that Americans are tired of seeing that higher education institutions have almost $1 trillion in endowment, yet they are saddling their students with unmanageable debt. So I think that Americans are coming around and getting smart to the idea that they're tired of what they're seeing in higher education.
I'd say, on the Democratic side, there has been a durable coalition behind accountability for about 15 years or so. And when we started gainful employment, most Democrats support it, certainly not all, but it has become, widely supported within the party. It's supported by civil rights groups and teachers unions and sort of other core constituents of the party. What I would like to see is more business community engagement in higher education and higher education outcomes. And if there is a way to bring employers to the table around what they need and expect from colleges, I think that would be tremendously powerful, politically being only one of the reasons why.
Thank you.
And that happened in K-12.
Okay, thank you both. We are at time, and so I want to thank all of you who are here with us today, virtually here in the room, for just a tremendous event. Thank you to the panelists from the previous panel, as well as Undersecretary Nicholas Kent, former Undersecretary James Cavall. Thank you for being here for this conversation. In a second, I'll ask you to join me in thanking him, but in the meantime, I'll ask you to remain in your seats just long enough for us to leave the stage. And thank you again, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.